Well, that's great. Well, I will start. So my name is Katrina Sullivan. I'm the program coordinator with the Germantown Library. So we thank everybody for attending tonight. I'm very excited for this because I also went to school for interior design. So architecture and design has always been a big fan and love of mine. So today we have Conrad Hanson, who is local to Germantown for several years, and I'll let him give a little bit more background on himself and his love of architecture and why we're interested in having him do what we're calling the architectural armchair tour. So we do appreciate you guys coming tonight. Any questions, if you wouldn't mind just posting them in the chat or holding off till the end of the presentation. And again, if you did bring a photo, just put your name in the chat that you have one, and that way we can get you on screen to show your house and give additional information about it. So Conrad, welcome tonight. We're very excited. So I'll have you take over.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrina. And thanks to everyone at the Germantown Library for having me here tonight. And the whole crew there has done such an excellent job through this crazy pandemic and serving the community. They've gone really above and beyond. And lastly, thanks everybody here for joining in on this Zoom talk on architecture. And I'm going to assume most of you are here because you've had some kind of interest in architecture, history, or Germantown, which I think is fantastic. I'm also going to sincerely hope that very few of you are experts in the field. And that's because I don't consider myself an expert at all. I consider myself more of what you'd call an architectural enthusiast. I don't have formal training as an architect, nor a degree in historic preservation or architectural history, but what I do have is a lifelong passion for the subjects, which has always fueled my desire to learn more about it. And some of the reasons I'm a big architecture fan include, one, our built environment, and more specifically, the houses people live in, reflect two things. They reflect both the individuals that live or have lived in them, as well as broader trends and historical movements which have happened outside of them. Another thing I love is when people reference architectural styles, it's sort of like you say potato, I say Pueblo Revival. The field is so full of experts and academic opinions. When talking about elements of architectural styles, there's a lot of room for discussion. Someone might say, oh, that's a Spanish Revival. Someone else could say, no, that's Mission Revival. And a third person might say, no, that's a California Mission Revival house. One of them may be right, but that doesn't mean the other two are wrong. And I think that kind of ambiguity is especially appropriate for these times we live in. And probably the third reason I grew to love architecture is that it requires little physical coordination or athletic ability. Houses don't move, they're not moving targets. You can take as long as you want to observe them. You can literally be the last person picked in gym class your whole life, and chances are you can move faster than a house does. Unless maybe there's a landslide or a tsunami, in which case you have more pressing issues to worry about than architectural style. Luckily, we don't have either of those here in the Hudson Valley, which is one of the reasons I like it here. But also, the Hudson Valley happens to be a great place for architecture buffs. We have buildings dating back well over 300 years, and its pattern of settlement, land ownership, and economic growth have led to an incredibly diverse array of architectural looks and styles. And even the towns within the Hudson Valley vary greatly between them. So the feel and look of Hudson to Tivoli to Germantown to Rhinebeck, each one has a unique look, unique architectural stock that sets it apart from its neighbors. And probably the biggest stroke of luck the Hudson Valley's had for architecture fans is that our population density is pretty low. Given that, we haven't had explosive growth which has led to wholesale destruction of buildings and building over them or new development. And with that, we're going to look at some of the architecture here in Germantown. And I'm going to go share my screen now. All right, so we're going to look at the architecture of Main Street in Germantown, and I'm calling this talk Form and Style because I will basically be toggling back between the two things. And by form, I mean the basic structural shapes and building blocks that comprise houses and give them their form and silhouette. And by style, I'm going to be referring more to more like applied decorative elements and historical reference. And most specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the houses on Main Street in Germantown, which from this point here near Hover Ave to just west of what is today 9G represents about a mile in length. And right now we're looking at a map from the 1870s of the town. And you can see it's not densely packed at all. And another map from the 1880s shows the same kind of thing. One of the fortunate aspects about Germantown is it's sort of, even as opposed to a town like Tivoli, where houses are much tighter packed, it was never very thickly settled, which has allowed for a lot of its older homes to be preserved. And here we'll have a sort of a look at the town today. You can see the houses still have plenty of space between them in spite of it being a small town. Now we're going to start our look at the architecture of Main Street at this house here. This is actually one of my favorite houses on Main Street in Germantown. And not because it's necessarily the oldest or the prettiest, but its basic form echoes one of the most commonly built types of houses in this country for a nearly 200-year period. It's referred to as a 1.5-story hall and parlor form house. Which basically consisted of 2 rooms downstairs, the hall where cooking and most daily activity took place, and a slightly smaller parlor, which people used for sleeping and sort of withdrawing from the main part of the house. There would be an upstairs to these homes. It would be accessed either by a ladder or a set of stairs, sometimes open to the hall, sometimes enclosed. They'd be heated by chimneys on either end. Sometimes, particularly in New England, you'd have centered chimneys between the 2 rooms. And this type of house was found throughout the Eastern Seaboard, wherever there was settlement, up until like 1840s and 1850s beyond. And each region had its own variation, whether it be Virginia, the Ohio River Valley, the Northeast. This was really the real backbone of architecture that was built. And a lot of times people will refer to these houses as vernacular or folk styles. And the term vernacular, sort of like aloha, is one of those terms that can have a million different meanings depending on who you ask. But for my purposes, it's generally going to mean a building built of local materials in response to local conditions without a conscious reference to a higher style movement. And this type of house here represents about 40% of the homes that were built in this country before 1840. So when you think about these towns with their lovely colonial architecture and their big Georgian houses or federal homes. Although few of them survived, there were probably many more of this type of houses found around them. And another aspect I like about this house is you can see here on the left a very large barn that was built recently. And that's because in small communities, in agrarian places, farmers, when they had the ability or the money, where they spent their money and resources would have been to house and protect their valuable commodities, their means of making a living, their livestock, their grain, their hay. Much, much more important than having an impressive house would have been to have an impressive barn. Any technological innovations would have gone towards that. If you think about it, if a neighbor did come over, he wasn't wanting to see your house, he'd probably want to see your barn. He'd want to see your livestock, he'd want to see your tools, your grain, that type of thing. And when I say that, I'm usually referring to men. If a man brought his wife over, she may join the farmer's wife on the porch and admire a new butter churn or something, but that was probably the extent of it in terms of showing off. Now, a step up from the hall and parlor house can be found across the street from this example. And this is what we refer to as a central passage house. Now, like the hall and parlor, they were one room deep generally, but what they did have was a central hallway separating the two sides. It gave rise to a more symmetrical type of house. And these types of houses are where you first start to see architectural embellishments added to most often, but still very simple. And over time, as economics would allow or families grew, houses needed to be added onto. In this example here, the original form of the hall and parlor house stays intact, but more often when it wasn't torn down and something new put in its place, it became a wing or a smaller addition, often on a larger house. Farther down the street, you can see a good example of that here, where the original house lies in the back, and it might have even stayed intact well into the 20th century because this appears to be a sort of mid-century addition put on the front of it. This same principle was applied to other houses on Main Street. This house here, this house there, they sort of carry on that vernacular tradition where they don't follow a set historical or style that's in fashion, but more spaces added and houses grow in response to needs. And while they may not be sort of academically pleasing, I think with their silhouettes and the way they sort of grow organically, they have also a very pleasant quality to them. Now we're going to go on to switch over from form to style a little bit. And some of the things that I really love about the evolution of American architectural style is that it reflects a couple things about our cultural in general that helps distinguish our architecture in America from some of the more consistent architectural styles in other countries. And that's one, Americans tend to get bored very easily. Two, we have very short memories. And three, we like to look back at the past with nostalgia. In starting to talk about the styles we find on Main Street in Germantown, we're going to begin with a few that were popular before the Civil War. I usually refer to these as the big three, and that's Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, and Italianate. The Greek Revival style really took hold in this country in the 1820s and was quite commonly found up through the Civil War. It's the first American style that could be widely found across all settled areas, and it was adapted for all economic groups. Part of this reason was because of Asher Benjamin, and who published a book called The Practical House Carpenter. This basically gave a guide for people to build Greek Revival houses throughout the country, from settled regions to newly settled regions, even as far as the frontier, as long as you could mill lumber and had the basic tools, you could build one of these books. And also an interesting thing to note is one of the reasons this was possible is because the United States, unlike some other countries, had very high literacy rates, even in the early 1800s. Not every, and I'll qualify that, not every white male, that is, necessarily could write, but most of them could read at the very least. And that really helped have a profound effect on the spread of architectural style in a really odd way. Now, the Greek Revival style was based on classical motifs and precedents. The interesting thing I find about the Greek Revival style is it wasn't the first classical style in the country. The federal style borrowed heavily on classical motifs. And before the Greek Revival style took hold, there was a style that was really heavily promoted, I'd say, by Thomas Jefferson, which is called Roman classicism. And it used the same forms, the same principles, the same classical orders as the Greek Revival style did, but there was a little bit of a problem in that the Roman classical style was associated with Great Britain. And less than a decade earlier, we got into sort of a nasty scrape with Great Britain called the War of 1812, where they burned our White House, they destroyed part of our capital. So there was a real anti-English movement at the time. And that extended to architecture, and it extended to the idea of the Roman Empire and its arrogant imperialism. At the same time, around 1820, Greece was fighting for its independence from the Ottoman Empire. So you had a bunch of sort of ragtag people fighting this massive empire, non-Christian empire to boot. It really sparked the imagination of the American people. So all of a sudden, even though they were basically using the same elements of style, someone would be, oh, look, there's a classical Roman building. And someone would be like, no, 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 that's a Greek Revival building. It's Greek, it's Greek. It's not Roman, it's Greek. So this style really took off. And as I said before, one of the things that made it appealing was you could have a very high refined style here, and then also it was very adaptable to middle-class building. Here in Germantown, you can see the former Fox Funeral Home. Here is sort of your temple front Greek Revival building that you find quite commonly in the United States. It has some vernacular leanings. A higher style building might have rounded Doric columns. This has squared ones. And an important element of Greek Revival architecture was the entablature, which consisted of the cornice, the frieze, and the architrave. This area here approximates that, and you can see it was simplified a great deal in many cases. In this house here, you go a step further. The columns are gone, but you can still trace that temple front form, and you can see sort of a deeper cornice here and frieze. And here, this house is actually a little off Main Street, but I wanted to include it because you can see how the Greek Revival style was adapted to various very modest houses as well. This house would be probably a little larger than the hall and parlor houses we saw before. An important difference would be that it did have a hallway to the side, but that entablature has been simplified to a wide frieze band here, with a series of windows to the second floor. So this style was predominant in America between 1820 and 1830. The Greeks won their War of Independence in 1830. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, that's great, fantastic. In terms of architecture, we were like, what's next? You know, it got a little boring, frankly. It was a little confining. There wasn't a lot of unpredictability to it. But fortunately, given our short memories, we turned back to England again. And we said, you know what? The English aren't so bad after all, maybe, but let's not copy their homes from, you know, their more imperial days. Let's go back. Let's go back to the Middle Ages, you know, when the British lived in cute country cottages and they went to nice little churches and didn't have to worry about anything except maybe catching the plague. And the Gothic revival movement was an offshoot of this sort of general romantic movement that was taking hold in literature and the arts as well. Gothic revivalism persisted from 1830 to the 1860s, but the elements of it, which included pointed arches, steeply pitched roofs, decorative verge boards and barge boards, castle-like towers, those elements would appear in other forms throughout the 19th century. And you later have things called Victorian Gothic and things like that. So even though this was its heyday, it never really went away. And like Asher Benjamin's books, the style was really widespread thanks to the books of A.J. Downing and A.J. Davis, who collaborated at times as well. They published plan books like Rural Residences, Cottage Residences, and the Architecture of Country Houses. It was promoted as very appropriate for rural settings, and it focused away from balance and symmetry and really celebrated more complex and irregular shapes. And here on Main Street, you have a very well intact Gothic revival house, sort of in the middle of it. And if you take a look, it follows fairly closely the forms of an ornamental farmhouse. Of course, it's not a direct copy, but you have similarities in the porch design here. You have this center gable with its steep lines. You have the drip molds, which were very common in Gothic revival architecture. You have the remnants of a finial. I think the top got broken off, but that's another very common element found. You can see this vertical siding. It's called board and batten siding, and it's somehow considered an offshoot sometimes as Gothic Revival style and known as Carpenter Gothic, which is sort of a little more casual than some of these more castellated styles. Now, you don't necessarily need board and batten siding for a house to be a Carpenter Gothic house, but every house with board and batten siding in the Gothic style is a Carpenter Gothic house, if that makes sense. Here's another Gothic Revival cottage that's at the eastern end of Main Street at Hover. And if you look at this one, its form really echoes that of the Downing Romantic cottages. And this farther down at the edge of Palatine Park Road is another small Gothic Revival house. You have this sinuous barge board here, the finial, all the hallmarks of Gothic Revival. Right on the heels of Gothic Revival came the Italianate style. This style was inspired by Italian farmhouses and villas set in the Italian countryside. It again fit into the Romantic movement, evoking an earlier period of history, later than the classical times, but far enough back to be very nostalgic and romantic, and not adhere to the rigid symmetry of classical forms. These were also included in the pattern books of Davis and Downing in the 1840s and 1850s. It also overall became much more popular than Gothic Revival. It is very commonly found throughout the Northeast and Midwest, very adapted in a lot of different formats. While it could take the form of a very sort of luxurious suburban villa, it was also adaptable to townhouses, to simpler homes, and houses like this, which are fairly familiar to many people. Now, one thing that's interesting to me is here in Germantown, there are very few houses that were built in the Italianate form and style, and in fact, none on Main Street, or at least none that survive. But what you did have was the application of Italianate style on some of these older homes, or new construction too. So that Gothic Revival cottage on Hover and Main Street at one time was given sort of this fancy Italianate front porch with its bracketing here. Likewise, a little farther to the west, you see the Lasher House, which had a side hall Greek Revival plan with this sort of wide wraparound Italianate porch applied to it. Even farther down on Lower Main Street, sort of at the western end of things we're looking at today, this is a fairly substantial house. Now, if you're on the inside of it, it is a typical house from the 1850s with its plaster work and its ceiling medallions. It would have probably in another place be built in a closer version of Italianate style, but here, the Italianate influence is really just felt on the porch, and the basic form of the house is very traditional. With its hip roof, it goes back to Georgian precedents. And I don't know if that speaks to a natural conservatism in the town in terms of architecture, or distrust of things newfangled. But I find it very interesting that this style and styles that followed, such as Second Empire and some others, were not widely adopted here in Germantown. Here we have a house that was built most likely in the 1840s and 1850s. And it follows the Greek Revival style. You have the wide frieze here, some, proportionally they're not correct, but pilasters which echo the Greek Revival style. But you also have the introduction of Italianate. These are not later parts. This was part of the original construction of the house. So if you look, you can, with a little imagination, see the temple behind this house. But then, so it got sort of this Italianate mashup at a certain period. And as late as the 1950s, the house had sort of a full-blown Italianate porch on the front of it, which could have come out of a textbook on the style. So again, here you have a house that was built for probably a substantial individual that did not necessarily adopt the latest style, but mixed two styles together in what I find is a very interesting sort of format. Now, when we talk about 19th century architecture, some big things happened that really helped the spread and accessibility of a multiplicity of architectural styles. When you began the 19th century with heating, you were looking at fireplaces. So they were part of the construction fabric of the house. Around 1840, you saw stoves being introduced for heating. They required just a metal stovepipe or thinner masonry chimney, much more portable, gave you a little more leeway in their placement. And then by the 1880s, you saw the introduction of furnaces, which were located in the basements, and you did not have to have this big heating unit in each of your rooms you lived in. At the same time, there was a standardization and innovations of production of building materials. As early as 1815, I believe, there were companies that specifically produced things like nails. So you weren't making each one by hand. They were made by machine, and you could buy boxes or barrels of them. Lumber, milling became very standardized. So you went from hand-hewn beams and timbers and rough sawed wood to a standard 2-inch board. Glass became stronger. It became more affordable, and decorative trim also became more affordable. Scroll saws were advanced. So not only could a good carpenter make decorative pieces for an Italianate house, they could also be produced by mills and factories. And with advances in transportation, it allowed companies to produce these pieces specially, so you could buy them and not have to make them. And you could transport large panes of glass on via the railroad or improved road systems where they're not bumping over a rough on the back of a wagon. So bigger panes of glass would end up at house sites unbroken with a greater frequency. which all helps move construction from braced framing. I have to consult my notes here. It was the most common way of building buildings up until, say, the 1840s. You needed special corner joints and braces for rigidity, which made people want as few exterior corners as possible, meaning unless you were wealthy or extremely pretentious, you built your house in the shape of a rectangle or square. With balloon framing, which was introduced in 1830, but then was adopted somewhat slowly over the next couple of decades, your construction was all done with 2-inch lumber. It made it incredibly easy to break away from these square and rectangular forms for houses. And where you see that in Germantown is you start seeing houses that are L-shaped. You start seeing houses that are cross-shaped. You see the introduction of bay windows. You have houses where they bring in store-bought architectural details. And even on this house, which was Gothic Revival, they added in some architectural elements that were probably prefabricated, and this might actually be a later bay window, but people almost wanted to show off how many exterior angles they could have in their house. And so it continued on. Houses got increasingly complicated and decorated, which gave rise to 2 styles after the Civil War you can find references to in Germantown. And the first is the stick style here on the left, which came into vogue around 1860 and lasted until 1880 or 90. And then the Queen Anne style, which lasted from 1880 to 1910. Now, at first glance, they are not too dissimilar. And what you have during this era, this post-Civil War era, is there is a big sort of fluidity between styles. Each successive style borrowed from another. So it wasn't as if someone went strictly in one lane or another all the time, but there were some differences that could set them apart. A stick style house will have a big emphasis on this sideboarding and the stick work, which is the decorative horizontal and vertical, sometimes diagonal wall treatments. They're not structural, they're decorative. It's a little more geometric than, say, some of the Queen Anne things that would follow. Towers are usually squared. You have these sort of sunburst panels here. With the Queen Anne style here, it gets a little looser. It's still, irregularity is highly prized, but there's a little more fluidity to the overall structure. And with Queen Anne, you saw the adoption of a lot of other motifs from other style periods as well. But you can sort of see how one is not that far from the other. And this house on Lower Main Street is a pretty close example of the stick style. You have the square tower, you have the horizontal and vertical decorative elements, you have the sunburst pattern on the porch here, you have the pendant and cross decoration of the gable end, and it's enhanced by this sort of multicolor woodwork. Now here, we saw this house a little before, it was the Lasher House, which was a Greek Revival house that had an Italianate porch added onto it at some point. And then at some point later in the 19th century, it got a stick style makeover. You had these decorative strips of wood added to the gable end with this cross and pendant decoration. They added this wing on at the same time. And here you see it again, more of these decorative elements, the bay window, these sort of geometric decorations here that reflect the stick style. Now, again, you could also take a look at this bay window and reference its stained glass, its form, and say it's a Queen Anne. So, it does, there is room for debate there. Now here we have a house that's a more typical Queen Anne. It has the irregular massing. It borrows a little bit from other sources. You have the fish scale siding contrasting with the clapboard. You have the narrow double windows, which were really introduced during the Italianate era. Its bracketing is not as angular as the example we saw before, and the porch posts are not in that sunburst pattern. Now, Queen Anne could get very, very decorative and laden with exterior ornamentation. And that was the case in a lot of towns. They often, their Queen Anne houses are those big sort of wedding cake houses or extravaganzas that people either love or hate. But this is a simpler version, and that's not uncommon in Germantown, because more often than not, what you have here is what people generally refer to as folk Victorian houses. These are houses that have some nods or references to what was happening stylistically at the time, but really were built in traditional forms. This house on Main Street is a very basic structure, but it references the Gothic revival with its steeply pitched gable here in the front. It has a little bit of an Italianate reference here in the window. And then it has the porch with some of the Victorian scroll work. Here again, you have a house a little farther west on Main Street. That's really, if you took off the front tower and porch, would be a very basic house, structure-wise. But they added on a little front tower with references to the stick style here. And again, you have the sunburst pattern on the porch. So it's really this recognition of what was going on in the high style movements, but without being slaves to the latest fashion. And so that's sort of what we mean by folk Victorians. And even in a certain way, the central house could be called that, with its arched window here and its decorative bracketing, but it's a pretty classic form that these decorative elements have been applied to. So as any time in history, once things go too far in one direction, they sort of swing back the other way. And by the end of the 1800s, there was a big reaction against the complication and the fussiness of the Queen Anne style and the stick style. And it was the arts and crafts movement, which took root in England, with people like William Morris here, promoted by writers, artists, and then moved into architecture as well. It was a reaction against the mass-produced elements that you found on these other houses, and the revival styles. There was a movement or a reflection of honest materials. So in your homes, you started using simple oak, river rocks, shingles, clapboards to build a more sort of organic type of style. And you see it here in stickly furniture of the time, which is a very simple and angular. It has references to, even medieval joinery here. So in the United States, the arts and crafts architectural movement took hold arguably first in California, and you had people like Graham and Green, who really tried to emphasize the beauty of handcrafted and natural materials in their architecture. You have the stone chimneys, the sloping roofs, shed dormers, simple trusses as decoration, deep porches. In some instances, they even began to reference Asian prototypes, Japanese homes, and this. So one of the styles that they emulated was based on the bungalow, which had its roots in India, adopted by the English, and then sort of adapted. And there was a style of house that became known as the American Craftsman or the California Bungalow. And we do have a couple of those here in Germantown. We have one at this end of Main Street, sort of towards the eastern side, and one not far here from the central school. And they both sort of built of different materials. This one has shingles, this one is clapboard, this one has shingled posts, this has brick piers with turned columns, but they both have this deep overhanging roofs. They have the very simple supports here as decoration. They also, at this time, they started to move towards more flowing layouts. These houses are both 1.5 stories. I don't know exactly what the insides look like, but I would guess probably there's an open flow either between the living room and the dining room, or the living room and the stair hall. It was a move towards a more casual way of living as well. These homes were also compact, they were affordable. They could be used in the suburbs, they could be used in towns, they could be used in the countryside. But there was another type of building during the arts and crafts movement that sort of blew these out of the water here. And that was the American Foursquare. And the American Foursquare or box, in some people's minds, it's a style, in others, it's a form. And it is characterized by its square appearance. It is cubic in form. It has a very simple, economical floor plan. And these really became the workhorses of American architecture between the 1890s and 1930s. You find them in cities, you find them in towns, you find them in suburbs, you even find them in rural areas. They, like the California bungalows, were relatively simple. They'd have oak interiors, not a lot of ornamentation. However, they would reflect different kinds of architectural styles, and they could be embellished. And here we have, towards the east side of Main Street, two sort of larger versions of this Foursquare house. And then on the western end of town, you have two of sort of these more smaller, more economical versions, but they all share sort of some of the same principles. They have the front porches. They are basically divided into halves in the front. There'd be a room here, a room here. This might be open. They had these dormers on their top floors. A lot of people also associate the Foursquare with the Sears house. And Sears and other building companies did sell a lot of these kit houses, but companies like Sears and Aladdin sold all sorts and styles of houses, and the California bungalows too. In fact, this Aladdin house, I think it was called the Sunshine Model, which cost $1,000, and that probably did not include appliances and heating, but it would include all the details, all the pieces you see here, and all the interior woodwork and trim. Is a pretty good ringer for this house that we have here on Main Street in Germantown. And likewise, the Carlton that they produced is not an exact duplicate of this house in Germantown, but close enough to think that this was probably could have been a kit house as well. So a very popular movement in architecture came along in 1876. The country was growing population-wise. It was growing at a tremendous rate economically, and we were really looking for a national style. What we decided to do was begin to look at elements from our own past, the colonial homes, and adapt that to try to create sort of an American style. Now, of course, the issue with that is all these motifs from colonial homes were really brought over from Europe. So we were really kind of recycling European elements to make our American style. But you can see here in this house on Main Street, the Colonial Revival influence in its Palladian window, and these garland decorations here, which would have been found in federal architecture more commonly. Germantown does not have a lot of what we would call Colonial Revival houses in it. This is an instance really where the style has been applied to what is essentially an overblown version of a Foursquare, but it serves to underscore that Colonial Revival was used on a lot of different types of homes. More often in town, you'll find those Colonial Revival motifs on civic or institutional buildings. You see a lot of the colonial and early American references here in the Germantown Telephone Company building, which was built, I believe, in the 20s, if not the 30s, maybe originally as a bank and later served as the post office. These also veer on neoclassical or classical revival or classical architecture, where you went back and we started borrowing heavily from the Renaissance again, and Roman motifs. Here at the public school, you can see an example of that. Some people would lump this all as Colonial Revival. others would parse it out into other styles. Now, the Colonial Revival movement also sprang like a million babies, like, and especially in the early 20th century. People started wanting Southern colonial houses, which might look like a little miniaturized version of Mount Vernon. They'd want, like a replica of Longfellow's house in Cambridge. They'd want a Cape Cod cottage. There was one of these little baby offshoots that became somewhat popular in Germantown, and it was really the only one, and that was the Dutch colonial. I'm going to hope that's not considered offensive or anything, but I don't think it is. I don't know if it's because there was no German colonial revival, but for some reason, the Dutch colonial movement affected more houses on Main Street in Germantown than aside from the Foursquares. And interestingly, in this area, when you think of the homes the Dutch were building during the colonial times, they really looked something like this or variations on this. They were not necessarily the stepped gabled houses you'd think of in towns or the pretty little canal houses. But when we're talking these kinds of revival styles, nobody wants to look at sort of basic rudimentary stuff. So designers turned to later Dutch styles, more commonly found in New Jersey and the southern part of the Hudson Valley. And its defining characteristics became the gambrel roof, flared eaves, and little stoop here. And within those basic elements, there was a lot of room for interpretation. So you'd see houses like this, where the gable end faces the street. It has the stoop, the gambrel roof, sort of a nod to the flared eaves. You have houses like this, where the gambrel disappears completely, but they add the flared eave around the outside, just so you know it's a Dutch house. And even this, which is essentially probably more accurately a stick style Victorian that has been shorn of some of its pieces. The fact that it has a gambrel roof, people call it Dutch colonial, and you know what? They're more than welcome to, and that's fine. So, like the Foursquares and like the bungalows, houses like the Dutch colonial could easily be bought at Sears or other house companies. In fact, this one here right next to the high school is a fairly close example to this one here. Sears and these companies played a big role in bringing these sort of style elements to the middle class up until, say, the 1930s, when unfortunately we had the Great Depression. One of the victims of this was Sears. They were financing mortgages and had to write off $11 million in bad debt. They had to stop production briefly, and it never really picked up again. I think they lasted until 42 or 43, but it sort of spelled the end of these types of homes built for your sort of average middle class family. And who stepped into the breach but the US government? And in the 1930s, we saw the birth of the FHA. there was a real desire for, or need seen for people to be able to own their own homes. So they had to be built economically. They had to be built with the most efficient use of space, with the least amount of cost. And this gave rise to what we call the minimal traditional house. So these houses were basically bare bones versions of vaguely traditional looking homes. The FHA set out standards it would underwrite mortgages on. And when people built those, you had better follow them. So they did. And it led to sort of a period of, I don't want to say stagnation, but it really sort of depressed innovation in design. In Europe at this time, there were some very interesting modern movements going on, but really you had to have a safe bet with a house during these times if you were building one and you were financing it and you were middle class. These houses are also referred to as Depression era cottages, economical small houses, and FHA houses. Now, even after the Depression lifted, these houses stuck around because you had another element. You had tons of returning servicemen who needed to be housed. They needed to be housed and their families in a very, along those same principles. It had to be quick to put together. It had to be economical. It had to have an efficient use of space. So these houses are also sometimes called victory cottages or post-war cottages or warrior cottages. You find these, like the simplified Cape Cod version, really, like Levittown is a good example of that. But these two are found on Main Street here. Now, as America prospered and the war was behind us, there was one style of house that was introduced during this time that became a runaway favorite as America moved to the suburbs. And that is the ranch house. They really worked well with car culture. They weren't concerned, because they were designed for suburban lots, on an efficient use of a narrow space. They let you sort of spread your wings a little bit. And at the beginning, they were usually made very basically, sort of that same idea of those post-war minimal traditional houses. But what's sort of interesting in Germantown is you have three right next to each other, and this one sort of echoes those. And then you have one immediately adjacent to it, which shows how they slowly started to evolve and take on stylistic forms. And then at a certain point, people wanted a little separation. They wanted their cars separated from where they were living, or where the kids were, the rec room separated from the bedrooms and the living room. So then immediately adjacent to those, you have this idea of the raised ranch, where the sort of recreation areas or the garages would be below and the living quarters above. And that, again, is the same sort of concept of the split level and things like that. And so even though they may be derided today, I think it's very interesting that Germantown, these are the only three examples on Main Street, and they happen to be next door to each other. So with that, I've pretty much covered the mile length of our town. And so it gives you sort of an overview of what we have here. It might not be like the most high style. It is not an encyclopedic version of the history of architecture in the United States, but it does touch upon some very typical and some more unique styles that were found throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And with that, I am wrapping up the talking portion of this talk.
Thanks, Conrad. That was great.
Thanks.
Very, very well, informative. So I don't have any questions in the chat. So did anybody bring a photo that they would like to show to Conrad of their house, or any information they would like to have additionally wise? I did have one note come through. A great talk, Conrad. Has anyone ever tried to get the Hamlet core listed on the National Registry?
Not that I'm aware of. And well, you know, it would take some organization, and I have a little bit of a mixed thing with historic districts too. I think historic districts can be great, and putting things on registries can be fantastic if it helps you preserve your house or helps you maintain a historic house. But sometimes in places where you have sort of a big mix of architecture, they can inhibit what I'd say innovation or new architecture. And I think one of the things that Germantown is lucky in that it doesn't have one particular style, is that you could build a very modern house in Germantown on an empty lot on Main Street, and it would probably add to its architectural story.
Let's see. Any other questions? Any homeowners in the houses that were shown to answer some of Conrad's question about how things were set up? That would be a good little inside information.
Oh, thanks, Matt.
Okay, you can see the chat. It's great.
Are we able to talk?
Oh, absolutely. Most definitely. Please do.
Conrad, you have the old-fashioned light in front of your house. Can you explain what era that's from?
You mean in my house?
Yeah, the street light out front, Martin Overington, the light.
Oh, hey, it is. It came off of the Rip Van Winkle Bridge during the 1960s while they were modernizing it. So it would date back to whenever the original Rip Van Winkle Bridge was built. And the owner of our house must have had some connection to someone who was dismantling it and bought 6 or was given 6 of the lamps. And we have 2 affixed to the back of the house, 2 in the yard, and the 2 at the lamp posts.
Fabulous.
And actually, it's funny, there was one.
Let me know.
There was one for sale at the antique store on Main Street.
Okay.
In Germantown, and the guy thought it was from the George Washington Bridge, and I corrected him because it's a dead ringer for ours. I don't know if he still has it.
Right, but you don't know what like architect era that's from.
It's probably a I would just guess WPA. If you look at old pictures of the bridge, I don't know when the bridge was built, but it's a 20, you know, it's a 20th century bridge. They put in these traditional looking lamps. So it's a 20th century revival style.
Thank you.
Yep.
We wanted to show a picture of our house and just find out, because I can't quite figure out where ours fit in. It's just kind of a boxy thing, but how do we do that?
You can, well, how would she do that, Katrina?
Do you happen to have the picture on your phone? You can just show for it to the screen. Or do you have a picture you can share your screen with? We could do it 2 ways.
I mean, it's on my computer. I don't have it on my phone.
You can also email it to me. That's fine if you can't get it on the screen.
Yeah, I didn't think about it ahead of time. Devin, if you know how to do this, let me know. It's in another part of the house.
Allow us to share.
How many Palatine houses are in Germantown?
That's a good question. I know of 2, and if you mean by Palatine, sort of the 18th century houses, the parsonage dates back to the 18th century. The Stone Jug, just south of town, was built by probably second generation Palatines, I think, given its date. One thing that's hard to, it would be easier to date some of these early houses if you could look at their understructure, their beams, as opposed to their exteriors, because a big thing about houses is windows get changed over time, siding gets changed, but if you can date the beams or see underneath them, you'd see more. But I only know of those 2 that date back that far.
A great question. We have one more in the box right now. Can you elaborate a little about balloon framing, what preceded it and what succeeded it?
Okay, so balloon framing, which is really most popular, it's construction that uses 2x4s and long boards that can extend up 2 stories. Now, what preceded it was this sort of timber framing. I call it post and beam framing, but it was where you'd make sort of the superstructure of the house out of these large beams, and the corners were held together more by mortise and tenon joints or by wooden pegs. And that would give you sort of these big rigid frames that you would build within. Then you'd build partition walls, that type of thing. Balloon framing, I think, came out of Chicago in the 1830s. It spread all over the country. That's not to say you won't find homes built all over that still used this old timber frame construction, but balloon framing was much lighter, easier, and you didn't need that skill level of making those corner joists. So actually it was much easier to build. It was replaced, I believe, by what is called platform framing, which is not too dissimilar than balloon framing, but sort of built along platform, I think.
Thank you, Conrad. So, Martin, I saw you started to share your screen, if you like.
Yeah, that was.
Was it? Okay.
Here, I can do it on mine because I have the picture on my computer.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
There you are.
So that's the original part of the house. Of course, we have this big addition on the side, but and
So-
I always just called it a farmhouse style. But
So yeah, you know, this is now when you're talking about architecture and when you go simple, it's, you know, sort of really easy. The easiest thing you can say, it's like a folk style or a vernacular style. But if both of these sections are original, you'd probably know it was built after the introduction of balloon framing. So, you know, you're probably talking closer to the Civil War or later. And I would guess the porch probably had a little more elaborate turns or spindles on it. So it would be sort of like more or less like a folk Victorian, probably originally.
Yeah, it has an active cistern down in the basement, which we still use. And this window up here is a bathroom. But one time we had the house appraised, and the guy who came said, "Can my wife come in too? Because her uncle Oscar used to live here." And it was Oscar Funk. And this is on Funk Road. We're at the bottom of Main Street. And she said that this bathroom used to be her uncle's bedroom. That was before they had plumbing in the house.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's as far back as, we know. We don't have a date, but.
Now, and it was a funk house originally. Have you looked against like the 1888 and 1873 maps of the town?
No, we haven't. And,
if you see the same house with the same name, that might help date it.
Okay.
Because both of those maps have, I believe, the individual houses, at least in that part of town, on them.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't like spent a lot of time at the parsonage, about our house. We're always there for other things.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of pictures from down Lower Main Street of the different, like when it was the Agway building, which used to be in front of this, between us and the river. And but this house is just always just a little off the picture, or just barely in the picture. So
have you ever you probably, I'm sure you've gone on the Photos by Gibson website.
Yeah.
Right, didn't Devin have a
Yeah, Devin was the one that put all that together for Bruce. So
Bruce, I was gonna say it might be in there, but I'm sure you would have seen it if it was.
Yeah, just one of those. But all right, thank you.
Sure.
I have a quick question to go back to the relation of, you're talking about the maps, Conrad. So if you're new to town, so you would find that information at the parsonage?
Well, you can find those maps, just Google historic map,
Okay.
Germantown, and they're readily available online as well.
Gotcha.
Those two, at least. There might be others that I don't know of.
Any other questions, or anybody else have a picture they would like to show Conrad?
There is some on the chat there.
Oh, let's see. Somebody did mention something about let's see.
Is 10 Church Street the oldest house in Germantown? I honestly do not know I honestly do not know which house would be the oldest. I have never done sort of an inventory or.
Yeah,
or
I wonder.
that way.
Well, our town historian Tom Shannon is on. Tom, do you possibly have the answer?
I'm not sure about 10 Church. I think my best guess is it's the Rockefeller Home, the old wing inside the Rockefeller Home is thought to date from 1755, which would make it a little bit older than the parsonage.
Is that the one that Lou Ray's house out on County Route 6, right?
Yeah, County Route 8. And
Right.
most of that house dates to 1808, but the oldest parts of it, 1755 or so.
That's great. Thank you, Tom.
And the other thing too, Katrina, is we could probably narrow down Martin and Kathy's house, because we know about when Funk Road was cut sometime in the middle 1800s.
Oh, great.
House from that.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, we can share that on social media afterwards, so everyone that is here can also be involved with our findings. That'd be nice.
I saw Kate's comment about the Dutch style timber frame, and that house, Kate, I believe it is on the National Register. I think, I'm not sure.
Yes,
it is.
Okay.
There's your answer. And then we have one, has anyone found any children boots in the walls of their old home? Like remodeling. I haven't, but our house is from the 1950s, so nothing good, no money hidden, no extra gems or fines.
I found ceramic bottles, but that's it.
I'm Adrian, Dawn, and we're down here in Cheviot, of course, down by the water.
And my neighbor Jo Hill found a silver spoon in her wall.
Mm.
And so her cottage is called Spoon Cottage. She named it that. We're in a house that's our original house was actually Nadine Rumke's family, the homestead. And it was I've always called it Victorian, but I have no idea when it dated, but it's a 3-story because it's on a steep hill. And there's at least one other one here that is still existing, where because it's on a steep hill and people were oriented toward the river and used the river, I think the entrance is on the kind of the basement. And then there's a balcony, maybe even 2, which is, another kind of distinctive architecture. And I don't know how to date it or what the style is exactly. If it's something specific to being on the river. I don't think I've seen any others like them in Germantown. Do you know what I'm talking about? Greg Esch's house. It's right on Disher Lane, just as you're kind of almost to the bottom of the hill.
And that's you think the original main entrance, like, and the front, so it's sort of like a half basement almost?
Yes, it's a half basement and a little rough, unfinished. I don't think it was the main entrance. The main entrance maybe is around to the side, but
it wasn't actually so uncommon to build on a slope, because also there was a time when a lot of people put their kitchens
right
on the lower floor, so you'd have access to that. And if it was on the river, it could very well have been, if they had something that was transported via river, it could have been used for whatever goods they did or produced or stored, to give easier access. Because also homes for lots of small artisans and craftsmen, before they build like separate shops, or if they were prosperous enough to build their own building, they made their things at home. Mm-hmm. So often something like that may have had that function.
Yeah, I think in our house was burned some years ago and was rebuilt as a more of a contemporary house, but the original house was also that 3-story, and we've definitely found the oyster shells or clam shells in the garden right outside the door. So that would have been a kitchen on the yeah. I'll look around and see if there are any others like them in Germantown, but it's very distinctive in Cheviot for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Conrad. That's really great.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I think we're all caught up on the chat, but we appreciate everybody coming today and enjoying some of the architecture. I know I learned a lot about some of it. I mean, I would love to buy a house for $1,000.46, but
they started at less than 1,000, which was great. Yes, and I just want to say thanks again to everyone who tuned in, and to everyone at the library, and also make a plug for people to support the library or your local library. They've done a wonderful job over this past year, and they don't charge for it. So if you can, please support them.
Thank you. We appreciate individuals like yourself helping us educate us as well. Learn more every day. So thank you once again. This is being recorded. So if you'd like to share or go back on for additional information, please do so. We will put it up on our website. Just give us a few days to fine tune the video, but it will be up there for additional support for you guys.
Great.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you.